The wind clawed at the wooden shutters of the small ranch house on the edge of the prairie, rattling them like bones in a gambler's cup as the night pressed, its weight heavy over the land. A night without stars, without mercy, the kind of night that swallowed men whole and left their names forgotten in the dust. And inside that lonely cabin lay a woman whose breaths came shallow and ragged, her body trembling as though the earth itself had cursed her with fever, sweat clinging to her brow, hair matted against her face, eyes glazed with delirium, whispering prayers to a God who seemed far too distant to hear them. And yet she held on, clutching the blanket tight to her chest, though it offered no warmth, only the illusion of safety against the cold shadow crawling through her veins. For she was alone, abandoned, left to die by those who had deemed her too much burden and too little worth. And the silence of her isolation echoed louder than the storm outside, until the sound of hooves broke through the night, slow and heavy, a horse's stride carrying with it the weight of destiny. And soon the door creaked open, spilling in a figure tall and broad, his hat pulled low, his coat soaked from the mist, a cowboy whose name the town whispered, but never called aloud. For he was a drifter, a man who carried trouble in his shadow and steel at his side. And yet in his eyes was something steadier than the storm, something that softened when he saw her curled on the bed, trembling, broken. And though his instinct had always been to keep moving, to never stay where the world could reach him, that night his boots carried him forward without hesitation, the wooden floor groaning under his weight as he crouched beside her, his hand hovering in the air, uncertain whether his touch would comfort or worsen her suffering. But the moment her fever-stricken eyes met his, there was no turning back, no walking away, for in that fragile, burning gaze he saw a plea stronger than words, a plea that cut through his armor, and he whispered low, rough as gravel yet steady as an oath, "Easy now, darlin', you ain't alone no more." And though she trembled, whispering something broken like, "Please, don't touch me," her body recoiled not from him but from the fire of her own sickness. Yet still he stayed, pulling a chair close, stripping off his gloves, his calloused hands reaching for the basin of water left near the hearth, soaking a rag and pressing it gently against her forehead, his movements careful, reverent, as though she were made of glass. And as the minutes stretched into hours, he kept vigil through the fever's grip, listening to her incoherent murmurs, catching fragments of stories about betrayal and loss, about the family who had turned their backs, about the loneliness that had carved hollows into her soul. And though she did not know his name, though she had no reason to trust him, something in the quiet strength of his presence steadied her trembling, anchored her against the darkness. And when the fire crackled low and the storm raged on, he leaned back in the chair, his eyes never leaving her face, whispering to the silence like a vow meant for the both of them, "You hold on, sweetheart. I've carried men through battle. I've carried my own damn sins across miles of desert, and I'll carry you through this night if I have to." And as her fever raged and her body shivered against the cold hand of death, the cowboy sat unyielding, a silent sentinel in the darkness, a man with no reason to stay but every reason not to walk away. And thus began the story of a woman who shook with fever, alone until a cowboy's steady hand reached through the shadows to hold her, not because he sought reward or redemption, but because in that moment he saw in her the reflection of his own haunted nights, and he knew some souls weren't meant to be left behind in the dark. The hours bled into one another like ink into paper, the fever refusing to release its hold, and the cowboy, whose name the townsfolk whispered as Caleb Mercer, though he had long since stopped answering to anything but the silence of the trail, sat with his elbows on his knees, watching the fragile rise and fall of the woman's chest, each shallow breath a battle, each tremor a reminder of how close she was to slipping into the kind of darkness no man could pull her back from. Yet something inside him, stubborn, raw, unyielding as the land itself, wouldn't allow him to consider losing her. For though she was a stranger, though he did not even know her name, he recognized the fight in her trembling frame, the kind of fight that only the broken carried. And he found himself speaking to her as though she could hear every word, filling the silence with fragments of his own story, words he had not spoken in years, telling her about the war that had carved scars across his soul, about the nights he had lain awake in camps where men never woke up, about the way he had wandered from town to town trying to outrun the ghosts of his past. And though his voice was rough, his words carried a strange gentleness, as though he wanted her to know that he, too, had been lost once, and still here he was, stubbornly alive, and so could she. And when her body shook with a violent shiver that nearly tossed her from the bed, he caught her gently, steadying her against his chest despite her weak protest, whispering in her ear, "Easy now, darlin'. Ain't no shame leanin' on someone when you're fallin' apart." And though she tried to pull away, too proud even in her fever, her strength gave out, and she sagged against him, her head finding his shoulder as if it had always belonged there, her hot breath against his neck making his throat tighten with something he couldn't quite name. And as he held her steady, he realized he was no longer just fighting to keep her alive for her sake, but for his own, because in her fragile breaths he found a reason he hadn't known he was missing, a purpose that pulled him back from the edge of his own wandering. And when the fever finally loosened its grip for a brief hour, her eyes fluttered open, glassy but clearer than before, and she whispered, "Why? Why are you still here?" Her voice broken like glass underfoot, and Caleb met her gaze without flinching, saying simply, "Because nobody should fight the dark alone." Words that hung between them heavier than the silence, and though she closed her eyes again, tears slipped down her cheeks, proof that she had heard him, proof that somewhere deep inside, hope was still alive. And as dawn's gray light crept through the shutters, Caleb rose only long enough to stoke the fire, fetch fresh water, and return to her side, his resolve hardening with each passing hour that if she was to walk through the fire of this fever, then he would walk it with her, no matter how long, no matter the cost. Because in that desolate cabin, two broken souls had collided, and though they had not yet spoken the truths of who they were or what shadows haunted them, there was no denying that fate had entwined them in a way neither could escape, and neither wanted to. The fever stormed back with vengeance as the sun climbed high, and by midday, the little cabin was filled with the sound of shallow breaths and the steady scrape of a chair as Caleb rose and sat again, pacing the floorboards worn with his boots, his restless spirit torn between action and the cruel truth that there was no doctor within 20 miles, only his hands, his will, and the stubborn belief that she would not die, not while he breathed. And so he did what he had always done when life offered him. No mercy, he fought with whatever scraps he had, grinding herbs he had found near the creek, soaking cloths, cooling her skin, coaxing spoonfuls of water past her cracked lips, whispering words he had never meant for anyone to hear, soft and steady like prayers, though he had long since lost faith in any heaven above. And still he stayed, hour after hour, refusing to let her slip from his grasp. And in the moments when her eyes opened, fever bright and full of pain, he would see flickers of the woman she was beneath, the sickness eyes that had once carried fire, lips that wanted to form words of defiance, but only trembled with weakness now. And when she finally rasped, "You don't even know me. Why do you care?" Caleb sank into the chair, elbows resting on his knees, and he said with a rough honesty that startled even himself, "Maybe I don't know your name, but I know the look in your eyes. I've seen it in men left for dead, in my own reflection, after the war fightin', for another breath even when the world's already written you off." And something in her gaze softened, though her tears betrayed her, rolling slow and helpless down her flushed cheeks as she whispered, "They left me, said I wasn't worth the trouble." And Caleb's jaw tightened, his fists curling, because he knew the cruelty of people who measured worth in what a person could give rather than who they were. And though anger burned hot in his chest, his voice stayed low, steady, like a rope thrown to a drowning soul. "Well, I ain't them, darlin'. I don't walk away from a fight, and I sure as hell don't walk away from you." And with those words, something fragile broke inside her, not from pain but from the sudden, terrifying relief of not being utterly alone. And though her fever shook her mercilessly, she let him steady her again, her head finding his chest, his heartbeat anchoring her against the chaos of her body. And Caleb held her not just to keep her from shaking apart, but because in that moment he realized he needed her too, needed the fragile hope she carried by simply breathing. And the longer he stayed, the more he knew he wasn't meant to keep drifting, wasn't meant to let her slip into the grave without a fight. And as dusk painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and red, Caleb sat by her side, whispering promises she was too weak to answer but strong enough to hear, that he would see her through the night, that he would not let the darkness claim her. And though the cabin was small, though the world outside was vast and cruel, In that one room, a bond was forged in silence and fire, a bond neither of them had sought, but both of them desperately needed. And as her trembling eased for the first time in hours, Caleb leaned his head back against the wall, eyes heavy but heart steady, whispering to himself more than to her, "Reckon maybe this is what it means to be alive again." And in the quiet of the prairie night, with only the crackle of the fire and the sound of her breathing to answer him, he knew that whatever came when the fever broke, their lives had already been bound together by this night of shadows, sweat, and stubborn survival. The longest night finally surrendered to dawn, the first thin light creeping through the cracks of the cabin, walls like a hesitant blessing, and Caleb, who had not closed his eyes once, sat with his back stiff and his jaw set, his hand resting against the woman's frail arm as though the very contact could anchor her spirit to this world. And when she stirred, softer than the sigh of wind against prairie grass, he almost thought he had imagined it until her lashes fluttered, her eyes slowly opening, not fever-glazed this time, but clearer, fragile though they were, like the sky after a storm when the clouds have begun to break. And in that moment Caleb froze, his rough, battle-worn exterior cracking under the weight of relief, because she was alive, truly alive. And when she whispered, her voice raw but steady, "You stayed," he leaned forward, the corners of his mouth twitching with a smile that felt foreign, like something buried deep inside him had been dug out and brought into the light again. And he answered in a low voice, thick with emotion he hadn't meant to reveal, "Told you I don't walk away, darlin'. Not from you." And her eyes filled with tears, not the tears of weakness this time, but of something she hadn't dared believe in for a long time, trust. And as her hand, trembling but determined, reached for his, Caleb felt something shift inside him. The old wounds of the war, the years of drifting like a ghost across the plains, all of it finding its meaning in the simple act of being needed. And when she whispered her name, giving him the first piece of herself she had guarded, it felt like a sacred gift, one he vowed silently never to betray. And though her body was still weak, though the fever had stolen much of her strength, Caleb could see the fire returning to her spirit, a spark he had promised himself to protect. And so he rose, stoking the fire, preparing food with the awkward care of a man who had lived too long in silence, each movement deliberate, each glance back at her carrying the unspoken vow that he would never let her be abandoned again. And as the day stretched on and her strength slowly returned, she watched him, this stranger turned savior, and saw not just scars on his hands, but the tenderness he tried to hide. And somewhere between the flicker of the fire and the sound of the wind against the plains, the bond between them deepened into something unshakable. And though neither spoke of the future, both knew in their hearts that this night of fever and survival had tied their fates together, as certain as the sun rose after darkness. And when evening fell again and Caleb sat by her bedside, she reached out, her voice still weak but her words strong, saying, "I thought I was going to die alone, but you gave me a reason to fight." And Caleb, whose eyes burned with unshed tears, bowed his head and murmured, "And you gave me a reason to live again." And in that small cabin, to broken souls who had once been lost found the beginnings of something greater than either, had dared to hope for redemption, companionship, and the promise of a tomorrow worth holding on for. And as the fire cracked and the world outside drifted into shadows once more, their silence was no longer heavy with fear, but alive with the unspoken truth that neither would ever walk through the darkness alone again. And if you, dear listener, have walked this far with them through the fever and the fire, through the loneliness and the light, then remember this: just as they found strength in each other, you can help us keep these stories alive by hitting that subscribe button. Because out here on the trail, every voice matters, and your support is the heartbeat that keeps our campfire burning. So saddle up, ride with us, and never miss another tale of the Wild West.